Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Pierre Jacob. He's our 5th speaker in the Philosophy and Neuroscience Speaker Series, which is supported by a generous grant from the Rotman Family Foundation. Pierre's the former director of the Institut Nicod in Paris. And just to give you some idea of the kind of intellectual life that he created at Institut Nicod, the Institut Nicod is part of the Département des Études Cognitives, and it has many different science units, neuroscience and psycholinguistics, and all of these different groups come together and meet, and they all bring in speakers. So sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 world-class speakers in the same week. It's pretty impressive. It's a thriving and stimulating intellectual community. I was fortunate enough to spend my first sabbatical there at Pierre's invitation, and as a colleague, Stephen Davis, who visits Institut Nicod regularly, said, and I think this sums the place up perfectly, he says, look, Chris, you get to work with all these really smart people doing really interesting things all day long, and then at the end of the day, you step outside and you're in Paris. Just no downside to this. I said, well, there's one. My sabbatical's going to end, but yeah, it's pretty good. So in addition to his directorship, Pierre's been the president of the European Society for Philosophy and Psychology. His work is focused on metaphysics of intentionality and philosophy of cognitive science. He's written several books, many of which we've all read, of course. Ways of Seeing with Marc Genereux with Oxford University Press, and What Minds Can Do, Cambridge University Press, are 2 of his major books. He's also written papers in virtually every major journal in the aforementioned fields. Topics he's written on include mirror neurons, the 2 visual systems, theory of mind, moral cognition, empathy, autism, and the list goes on. I'll just mention one more. He has a paper with the title, A Puzzle About Belief Ascription. But only yesterday, I think he unintentionally solved another puzzle about belief ascription. When I was visiting him in France, he would sometimes go to the other London and give a talk, and I asked him what he thought, and he said, well, you know, sometimes you take the train in and you don't go through the nicest parts of town. So, you know, being in France, I was practicing my French with him. He told me, Londres n'est pas jolie. Well, yesterday when he arrived, I said, are you happy to be back? And he said, yes, London's very pretty. So there's another little puzzle solved. Today he's going to tell us what's so special about human social cognition. Pierre Jacob.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And I'm very happy to be here. I'm also very honored, and it's also an occasion to see friends and people who I have met in the past, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to ask the question, ambitious question, what is so special about human social cognition? And I will try and offer a 3-tiered answer to this question, composed of the 3 following propositions. So first proposition, only humans are able to track the contents of others' false beliefs. Second proposition, which is part of my 3-tiered answer, it is that only humans are able to engage in ostensive cooperative communication. Now, what I mean will become clearer, I think, ostensive cooperative communication, but I can summarize or give you a kind of a preview of what I will mean, which is that the basic goal of the an agent's ostensive communicative act is to actually manipulate, change the recipient's mind by causing the recipient to acquire a new desire for action or a new belief. Okay, that might not be clear enough now, but I think it will become clear later. And the third proposition of my 3-tiered answer to my question, what is so special about human social cognition, is that the capacity to track the contents of others' false beliefs derives from the demands of ostensive cooperation. Okay, so that's what I want to argue. Now, there are 2 influential answers from 2 leading developmental psychologists with whom I not entirely agree. I agree with them that if not all, at least much of the answer to my question is likely to come from the developmental investigation of the social capacities of preverbal human infants. Now, one of these leading developmental psychologists is Mike Tomasello, who is famous for advocating the view which is called shared intentionality, and roughly speaking, according to which, I'm sorry, I think there was some change in the formatting of my PowerPoint, but I hope it won't damage too much the PowerPoint. But anyway, so the view that Mike Tomasello advocates under the notion of shared intentionality is that human infants have a species-unique motivation for sharing intentionality with others, by which he means to entertain what he calls, following John Searle, we intentions. Okay? So that's his view. There is another important view that's been advocated by Liz Spelke, famous developmental psychologist, which goes roughly like this. The uniquely human combinatorial language faculty is what enables human children uniquely to combine what she calls social core systems, which are shared by humans and non-human primates, and which would otherwise remain separated. You can't see this on the computer. So, but okay. So I will start by talking about my first proposition, which is what's distinctive about humans as opposed to non-human animals, is that humans and only humans can track the contents of others' false beliefs. And I will start by providing some evidence that preverbal human infants actually are able to track the contents of others' false beliefs. This is a controversial claim that I'm making, but I will give you some evidence supporting the claim that preverbal human infants are able to track the contents of others' false beliefs. So in this classical experiment published in 2005 in Science by Onishi and Baillargeon, 15-month-old are familiarized with, sorry, I can't find, yeah, with seeing on the first two boxes, two containers, a yellow and a green one. The window, as you can see, is closed, and there's a watermelon, a toy. And then the window is open, and they see an agent appear in the window, retrieve the object, place it in the green box, and that's the first of the 3 familiarization trials. And in 2 subsequent familiarization trials, they see it again. So they see again the agent play with the toy and place it into the green box. Now, in subsequent, what they call belief induction trials, 15-month-olds see either the toy move or not move from the green to the yellow box, okay, either while the agent is being present or in the agent's absence, okay? And in the test condition, the test trial, they see the agent appear and either retrieve the toy from the yellow box or reach for the yellow box or reach for the green box, okay? And what the findings are is that the 15-month-olds looked reliably longer when the agent reached towards the toy's actual location with a false belief rather than a true belief, okay? And also towards the empty location with a true belief rather than with a false belief, okay? Suggesting that infants, 15-month-olds, seem to expect an agent to act in accordance with the content of her either true or false belief, okay? Now, in this very recent experiments, we moved from 15-month-old to 6-month-old. So I just thought that's an interesting experiment because it's, so far as I'm aware, the experiment reporting some kind of false belief understanding with the youngest children that had ever been registered or reported in a journal. So the experiment was run by Southgate and Vernetti, published in 2014. And what happens is this, okay? So the kids see a woman that is in front of an opaque box, and either what they see is that the agent is watching while a blue ball is jumping into the box. Then the agent leaves the scene, and while the agent is away, you can see that the ball jumps miraculously outside the box, so that now when the agent faces the box again, she must falsely believe the ball to be in the box, while the infants know that the box is empty, okay? And so you see that A+ and O- stand for the agent must have the belief that the ball is in the box, while the children, the which are abbreviated by O, do not believe that the box contains the ball. Okay, is that clear? Okay. Now, in the other condition, what they saw is just the reverse. So now they see that when the agent is present, they see a ball jump into the box. The agent leaves. While the agent is away, now the ball jumps back into the box, so that now when the agent returns, she falsely believes the box to be empty, right? While in fact the infants know that the ball is in the box. Okay. Now what the experimenter did was to record something called alpha rhythm, which you can record using EEG, which EEG is placed on the infant's motor cortex, and the decrease of the alpha signal is widely taken to be interpreted as rise of sensory motor activity in the motor cortex of an observer, while the observer is actually watching an agent's action. Okay, so decrease of alpha signal is evidence of rising motor activity in the brain of an observer who is watching an agent performing an action. Okay, so what they found was a decrease of alpha signal in the brain, the sensory motor cortex of these 6-month-old infants. You see this is decrease and this is not decrease, okay? Only in the condition in which the agent had the false belief that the ball was in the box when the infants knew that the box was empty, okay? They did not register a decrease of alpha signal, which means increase of motor activity, when the infants saw the agent with the false belief that the box was empty when they knew that the ball was in the box. Is that clear? So that's evidence that's interpreted by the experimenter as evidence that this rising motor activity in the motor cortex of these infants who are watching an agent who is on the verge to perform an action of retrieving the ball in the box is only being observed when the agent has the false belief that the box contains the ball, not when the agent has a false belief that the box is empty and is unlikely to act towards the ball because she falsely believes that the box is empty, while the infants know that actually the box contains the ball. Is that okay? Okay. All right. So now I want to argue that not only do infants track the contents of an agent's false belief when the agent performs an instrumental action, but also they are able to track the content of another's false belief when the agent is performing a different kind of action, what I take to be a different kind of action, a communicative action. Okay? So this is a famous task which was published by Southgate, Chevalier, Shibra in 2010. It's called the Cepho task. In this task, a first experimenter, whom I call E1, places a pair of toys into a pair of opaque containers and then leaves the scene. And then a second experimenter, E2, switches the locations of the toys while the first experimenter is away. And then the first experimenter comes back, points to one of the boxes, addresses the 17-month-olds, and says, and I quote from the paper, "Do you know what I put in here? There is a Cepho in here." That's why it's called the Cepho task. There is a Cepho in the box. Shall we play with the Cepho, constantly alternating gaze between the infant and the referred to box? Can you get it for me? Okay? And the findings are that the 17-month-old reliably give the first experimenter the object in the undemonstrated box. Remember, the agent has a false belief about which is the box that contains the Cepho, the object she calls the Cepho, because when she was away, there was a second experiment that switched the location of the two objects. All right? So in order to fulfill the first experimenter's request, infants, 17-month-olds, toddlers, preschoolers, must have understood her referential intention and represented the content of her false belief. What about apes? I'm talking about distinctive human capacities. So this is, I quote from a famous paper by Cal and Tomasello, 2008, called "Does the Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind 30 Years Later?" And you remember that "Does the Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind" was the title of a paper by Premack and Woodruff, 1978. This is 2008. And what they write in this paper, Cal and Tomasello, is there is solid evidence from several different experimental paradigms that chimpanzees understand the goals and intentions of others as well as the perception and knowledge of others. And the famous kind of data for the view that they understand knowledge and perception is the kind of experimental paradigm invented by Tomasello and Hare, where basically what they did was to have two chimpanzees in a hierarchical structure where one is a subordinate and the other one is a dominant, okay? And what happens is that there are two pieces of food, one which is visible to both the subordinate and to the dominant, and there's another piece of food that's occluded from the dominant. And by letting the subordinate enter the room first before the dominant has a chance to move in, they can measure the ability of the subordinate to track the ability of the dominant to know whether there is food behind the occluder, and to tell whether the subordinate will choose the food that's visible to both or the food that's hidden from the dominant. And what they found was that reliably, chimpanzee in this competitive situation, the subordinate will choose the hidden food, the one that's hidden from the dominant side, suggesting that, in fact, they can compute the fact that from seeing something, the dominant would know there's food and would then be likely to fight or get into some kind of fight with the subordinate. Now, they tested a situation where instead of having an opaque occluder, there was a transparent occluder, and when there is a transparent occluder, you see that unlike the asymmetry between visible and hidden with the opaque occluder, there is no reliable difference in the behavior of the subordinate for the transparent occluder. Okay. Now, they further write in that paper, nevertheless, despite several seemingly valid attempts, there is currently no evidence that chimpanzees who understand that seeing leads to knowing, that these chimpanzees understand false beliefs. Okay. Now, humans can point, as you can see in this picture, but either they point for reaching, which is something that's very much investigated here by Jody, for example, reaching and grasping or not grasping, but also for communicative purposes, okay? And I'm going to talk about, it's really, the gesture is very similar, but the significance of pointing for reaching and pointing for communicative purposes is quite different. Okay, so here there's a problem with my thing. So this is an experiment by Tomasello's group. The first author is Benner. And 12-month-olds have been shown to understand another's act of pointing, as in here, when the children know that an object is either in this location or in that location, but they don't know which, so that the pointing is the purpose of the agent's pointing, the other's pointing, is to help the 12-month-old find a toy by the pointing, okay? And the evidence shows that, yes, they can make sense of the pointing as indicative of where the location, which is the location of the toy that the infants are looking for. 12-month-old have also been shown by Benner, this is Tomasello's group, to be able to accurately produce pointing to help someone else find a toy, which this other person knows to be hidden in one of two possible locations, but she doesn't know which one, okay? Now, apes, the evidence suggests, are not able to do this, and I'm now going to quote from a very nice recent book by Tomasello called A Natural History of Thinking, in which he writes the following. When a human first sets up with them, the chimps, a competitive situation and then reaches desperately toward one of two buckets, great apes know immediately that the food must be in that one. If a human points and looks at some food on the ground, apes will follow the pointing, looking, and so take it. But if the food is hidden in one of two buckets and the ape knows it's in only one of them and a human points to a bucket, apes are clueless. Apes make the competitive inference. He wants in that bucket, therefore the food must be in there. But they do not make the cooperative inference. He wants me to know that the food is in that bucket. So why is it that apes do not make the cooperative inferences and only the competitive inference in using Tomasello's jargon? Well, I'm going to argue that pointing requires three basic skills. First of all, the recipient of cooperative pointing must be sensitive to what I will call an agent's ostensive signals, and I will make this notion of ostensive signals clearer. Secondly, the recipient of cooperative pointing must be able to track what is currently often called common grounds with the agent. Thirdly, the recipient must also be able to evaluate the reliability of the agent, okay? And my hypothesis, or I guess it's also Tomasello's hypothesis, is that apes lack either some or all of these three required skills, all right? So I'm going to talk about each of them. So when I say pointing is ostensive, what I mean is the following. I borrowed this notion basically from Sperber and Wilson, but it's been very common and it's widely used now in developmental psychology, in particular by the people like Shibra and Gergely in Budapest. So an ostensive stimulus I take to be a stimulus that's produced by an agent, the agent who is engaged in a communicative action, to provide her recipient with evidence that she has a communicative intention, the communicative intention to convey some information that's relevant to the recipient, to the addressee, all right? Now, before pointing, in those experiments by Benner, when you see an experimenter that's pointing to one of two locations where to indicate the location of a toy to a child, the agent addresses the recipient by direct eye gaze and makes sure that the agent and the recipient are sharing attention on the target of a pointing. While the agent is pointing, she alternates gaze between the target and the recipient's face. And I think you will recognize this as familiar when you are trying to address, to draw someone's attention to a particular object or for a particular location for some reason or another. Now, this is in turn facilitated by the human ability to automatically track others' visual attention, which rests presumably on the human ability to track others' gaze direction with or without an agent's head movement, something that chimps don't do. Chimps cannot seemingly track another's gaze direction without the agent's moving head, okay? But humans do, and this is illustrated by this famous portion of a painting by Georges de la Tour, where you can see how you can actually track this woman's gaze direction very clearly, and what is involved, what makes it possible probably, is the morphology of the human eye, which has a deep and sharp contrast between the darkest spot and the white surrounding sclera, where you can, which is illustrated here, and you can see here that non-human primates lack this sharp contrast between a colored or dark sclera surrounded with a white area. All right. Now, I talk about ostensive signals. Again, this is not nice, but this is an experiment that was performed by Sanju and Shibra in 2010, I think. 6 months old, so an agent was confronted with two different objects. And what they did was to compare whether the infants followed the agent's gaze, either when they were preceded by, when the agent change of eye gaze was preceded by ostensive signal or was not preceded by ostensive signals. And there were two kinds of ostensive signals that they studied. One was eye contact. So in one condition, the agent looked at the children, and that's an ostensive signal to actually look into the recipient's eyes, versus did not look into the recipient's eyes, but had her head down. Okay, so this is ostensive signal, this is not ostensive signal, and the ostensive signal here is eye contact, meaning that the agent has a communicative intention to convey information relevant to the recipient. The other ostensive signal was saying hello in motherese, in infant-directed greeting, versus saying hello in adult-directed greeting, where the hello in motherese, in infant-directed greeting, is taken to be an ostensive signal for preverbal infants, okay? And then she turned her head towards one of the two objects, and then this showed that in the eye contact condition, this amount of kids followed the agent's gaze toward the object. In the no eye contact, almost none did. in the infant-directed speech, this amount of children, of infants, followed the agent's gaze on this object, while in the adult-directed speech, which is not ostensive for preverbal infants, you see that they didn't. Okay. Now, so this is my point about the claim, the requirement that a recipient of cooperative pointing must be sensitive to an agent's ostensive signal. My second requirement is that a recipient of pointing must track common ground, must be able to track common ground with an agent. Okay, so if you think about pointing in a communicative context, as opposed to pointing to reach an object or to touch a surface, pointing in a communicative context, a protruding index finger is inherently indeterminate or ambiguous. So, for example, if you are walking with someone in the desert and you see someone point to in the direction towards, for example, the coconut tree, you can ask whether the agent is pointing to share experience of the landscape with the recipient, whether the agent is pointing to teach the recipient what a palm tree looks like, to inform the recipient about the presence of food, to inform the recipient about the likely presence of water, to inform the recipient about the presence of shade, to inform the recipient about the possible protection from predators, and so on. So the success of cooperative pointing requires, in order to disambiguate the pointing, requires the recipient to keep track of common ground with the agent. Now, there is evidence, again from Tomasello's group, and the first author of this study is Liebel, that 14-month-olds are able to keep track of common ground. So in these experiments, children who were 14 months old played with two experimenters. They played one game with one experimenter, which was a game of cleanup with an experimenter, cleanup objects, and the same children played a second game with a puzzle game with a second experimenter, E2, okay? And in response to both the first and the second experimenters pointing to the very same object that was used in both games, an orange triangle, okay, the 14-month-olds were able to keep track of their respective common grounds because they did not respond in the same way whether they had played a puzzle game or a game of ordering the objects, okay? So that's evidence that at least when they are 14 months old, infants are able to keep track of the common ground with agents of communicative action, in this case nonverbal, but pointing. Now the third requirement skill that I mentioned was that the recipient of cooperative pointing must be able to evaluate the reliability of an agent. So now what I want to say, I want to analyze what it takes to understand pointing when pointing is part of ostensive cooperative communication. When, for example, the agent means to tell the recipient that there is relevant information where she is pointing. So first of all, a communicative agent must have what I call, following Sperber and Wilson, an informative intention. And in general, what it is for a communicative agent to have, entertain a communicative intention, is to make something manifest to the recipient. That is, to cause the recipient to acquire either a new belief that some fact obtains, or to acquire a new desire to execute a certain action in accordance with the request of the communicative agent, okay? But the communicative agent has not only such an informative intention, which is to change the addressee's or the recipient's mind by acquiring either a new belief or a new desire, but also a communicative intention, which is the intention to make her own agent's informative intention manifest to the recipient, okay? So now, given that the agent has both the informative intention to change the recipient's mind and the communicative intention to make her informative intention manifest to the recipient, okay, to the addressee, the task of the addressee of such a cooperative communicative action is to fulfill the agent's it's twofold. On the one hand, the recipient must be able to fulfill the agent's communicative action by recognizing which is the agent's informative intention, okay? Which is, so the agent has the communicative intention to make her informative intention manifest to the recipient. First task is to recognize what is it, what is the content of the agent's communicative intention, namely what communicative intention to make her informative intention manifest to the recipient, okay? So understanding, the first task of the recipient is to understand, if you like, the agent's communicative intention. That's fulfilling the agent's communicative intention. Whether, in addition to fulfilling the agent's communicative intention, the recipient will also fulfill the agent's informative intention by changing her mind and acquiring a new belief or acquiring a new desire, is something that's complete, that humans are free to do, okay? Okay, so here I'm just saying that, you know, in bees, when bees communicate, they do not have a choice between understanding the meaning of a dance and complying with the instruction that is conveyed by the dance, okay? There's no, bees are not free to recognize the agent's communicative intention and not to fulfill the agent's informative intention. But I claim that humans are free to do so. So a mature human recipient does have the choice whether or not to fulfill the communicative agent's informative intention once the recipient has understood, has recognized what the agent's communicative intention was, okay? Now, a recipient can recognize the agent's informative intention and thereby fulfill her communicative intention without fulfilling the agent's informative intention. That is, I can understand that you would like me to believe that it's the weather outside is horrible. Whether I believe you, whether I acquire that belief is up for me. I mean, whether you are reliable, whether you're authoritative, whether you're making a joke, and so on and so forth. So in human communication, I mean, I took an example, a verbal example, but pointing is the same. I mean, if I point for you to a certain location in order to make you believe that the toy is on my right, when in fact it's on your left, you're free to actually accept the belief that is congruent with my pointing to the right. Okay, so the recipient can fail to accept a new belief if the recipient does not take the agent to be reliable, that is, to be competent and also benevolent. And this is very important, and most of what I'm going to say for a few minutes now is really very much influenced by the views of Dan Sperber and collaborators. But I want to suggest that the reason why humans are free to either fulfill or not fulfill an agent's informative intention and change their minds in accordance with a communicative agent's informative intention partly reflect the fact that the interest of an agent of a communicative action and the recipient of the agent's communicative action overlap but are not strictly identical. Okay, so I borrowed this matrix to Dan Sperber, and so you can represent things as, on the one side, what's to the advantage or disadvantage of an agent, and what's to the advantage or disadvantage of a recipient. Okay, so an agent of, let's restrict ourselves to assertions and exclude requests. Okay, so let's only consider communicative actions which are expressive of a communicative agent's own beliefs. Okay, where the task of the communicative agent is to try to change the recipient's mind by causing him to acquire a new belief, not a new desire. Okay, so the agent can either be truthful or untruthful. The choice for the recipient is either to trust or distrust what the agent, the content of the communicative agent's act. Okay, now if the agent is truthful and the recipient trusts the agent, then both stand to gain from the communicative act. If the agent is not truthful and the recipient trusts, then the agent whose major goal is to be trusted will win something, but of course the recipient will lose if the agent is not truthful. Okay? If the recipient does not trust the communicative agent who is truthful, then the communicative agent will lose, and it will not affect the interest of the recipient, and if the recipient is distrusts the agent and the agent is untruthful, the agent will lose, but also the recipient will not affect the recipient. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the risks of deception. The opportunities for deception are, of course, enlarged by verbal communication compared to nonverbal communication. Okay, so this is an example which I borrow from recent history, 2003, I think, when George Bush said, we know that Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction. Okay, he said so, and you were free to fulfill Bush's informative intention by acquiring a new belief congruent with the content of the belief he expressed, or to distrust and not believe what George Bush was saying. Okay, so a recipient can perfectly understand a speaker's utterance and fail to endorse the belief that the speaker intends him to. That's the distinction between fulfilling the agent's communicative intention and fulfilling the communicative agent's informative intention. Okay, this shows that understanding is not sufficient for acceptance. You can understand and fail to accept. If you don't trust, if you think that the communicative agent wants to be to hurt, to damage you. But I want also to stress that understanding is not always necessary for acceptance, as has been argued by my colleagues, the French philosophers Reconnaty and Sperber. I'll give you one example. Okay, so take the proposition expressed by this utterance. There are more real numbers in the interval between 0 and 1 than there are natural numbers in the whole set of natural numbers. Now, I myself believe that this proposition is true because I also believe that the mathematician Cantor proved it, but I don't fully understand it because, for example, I would be unable now to spell out the proof. So I'm almost done, and I want to spell out my concluding conjecture, and then I'll be done. Okay, so I think you can think of there being an arms race between the capacities of agents of verbal, ostensive, communicative actions that evolved, that must have evolved a capacity for deceiving recipients and thereby to keep track of the contents of the false beliefs of the recipients that they caused as communicative agents capable of deception. So there was an arms race between those capacities of communicative agents to deceive their recipients and the recipient's capacity to evaluate the reliability of the speakers, that is, their competence and their benevolence. So I remember that to the question, what's so special about human social cognition, I argued for a kind of three-tiered answer. First proposition, it's distinctive of humans that they can track the contents of others' false belief. I gave evidence that infants can do it. The second proposition was that it's distinctive of humans that they can engage in what I called ostensive cooperative communication, and I spelled that out in detail. And the third proposition was, and that's what I'm actually speculating about, was that it's the capacity to engage in ostensive communicative, cooperative communicative actions that is a condition for tracking another's false belief, because the fact that humans evolved both the capacity to be the agent of a communicative act which could deceive a recipient, and that you also evolved as a recipient able to track the deception of a communicative agent, that the ability, therefore, to cause deception in others and to protect yourself from others' deception, I claim, is at the root of the ability to track others' false belief. Okay? And that's it.
Okay, we have time for some questions.
Pierre, that was wonderful, and I learned a great deal. There was one kind of social cognition which you didn't mention, and I'm surprised it wasn't on your list. And that is the ability, coming back to Chris's introduction to you,
Yes.
to attribute referentially opaque beliefs to others. To recognize, for instance, that Chris thinks that London is pretty and doesn't realize that Londres est jolie.
Right.
Or Chris thinks that Santa Claus is coming when I know perfectly well that there's no such thing as Santa Claus.
Right. So, okay, so you're right that I used basically the ability to track the content of others' false belief as the major mind reading ability involved. But you're right that when you look into it, there are further capacities dealing with understanding others' beliefs, which is linked to but different from tracking the contents of others' false belief, like taking, for example, let's say the understanding the intentionality with an S, as linguists and philosophers and logicians talk. So let me spell out what that means in a very rough way. So when a context is extensional, that means that you can, for example, you can replace a singular term by a co-referential term. So for example, if you say Cicero was fat, if that is true, then if Cicero is co-referential with Tully, then if it's true that Cicero was fat, then it's true that Tully was fat, and that shows that Cicero was fat is extensional, okay? But you can well have a case in which Chris believes that Cicero was fat. It's a fact we believe, or we know that Cicero and Tully are co-referential, but if you switch Cicero, replace it by Tully in Chris believes that Cicero was fat, you move from a true report ascription to a false report ascription, and that's the intentionality with an S of belief context report. Okay, and you're right that I did not mention intentionality of belief with an S as also, and that shows in several experiments. One reason I didn't, okay, is that the state of developmental findings so far is rather controversial. So as I read the literature, I find the evidence that infants, much before they can speak, I mean, some of the few experiments I gave show that at a time when they fail many false belief tasks, if you use the right method, you can show that preverbal infants are able to track the contents of others' false belief. It's contentious, but I can defend it. The question whether very early infant, very young children understand the intentionality with an S of belief is more controversial, although there is some evidence, it's much more controversial, and it's only emerging now, whereas the evidence for false belief, early false belief understanding came in 2005. We are only now scratching the surface of whether or not these infants understand the intentionality as they understand the content about this false belief.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I had a question about the table you showed before about
Sure.
the communication.
Yes, let me go back to it.
Yes.
Okay.
So, two things. Doesn't this look like a prisoner's dilemma?
A little.
Yeah. The other thing is that I was thinking about the cell with loss neutral, with truthful and distrusting.
Yes, so this one.
Yeah. Doesn't the payload for the recipient depend here on the content of the information that the agent wants to broadcast? Because if the content of the information would be helpful
Yes.
to
the recipient.
The recipient would lose
From not trusting it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, so
it seems to me that
yes,
in general
okay.
the payload
Understand.
depend on
Okay.
the content
Okay,
of,
okay. So
of the communication.
Okay, so you may be right. I mean, I'm not sure that if a speaker is truthful and you're skeptical, you remain skeptical, so you don't accept the presented information, it hurts you. I mean,
Not always.
not
Sometimes.
okay. So you think it's yes. Okay, so it may be that for some kind of information, if it's urgent and you can't wait, if you wait, it will be a catastrophe. Then it's not neutral, but it's damage. It's damaging. It can hurt if you actually do not trust the.
Yeah, and this seems to be particularly important because
Yes.
these would be the
Yes.
primary, the first examples of communication
Right.
in the hunter-gatherer
Okay.
environment.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
there is a lion over there.
Right.
If you don't trust me, then
Right. So
you are eaten up by the lion.
That's right. So the question is, okay, so if we actually have to refine the matrix, because, as you point out, there are cases where remaining distrusting an agent could be damaging, as you point out. Not sure whether it affects the point that the interests of the agent and the recipient may overlap but are not identical in all cases. That's so even if you, as you suggest, and I'm ready to revise it and make it more refined, I think it's still I'm thinking that it might still be consistent with the thesis that the interest of a speaker, which is really to be trusted, and a recipient, which is to be provided with truthful information, are not always identical. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a good point.
His was a good point.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering your thoughts on the sort of species specificity of the ostensive communication, and couldn't this be a possibility here that if, for example, these great apes are distrusting of this strange creature giving them communication, that they may be receiving the ostensive communication but then choosing not to act on it?
I see.
Because I don't know whether I would trust a great ape or not if they were communicating with me.
You mean because of the species difference?
Yeah,
or
well,
something?
maybe they just.
So you're saying that if you were more careful about studying chimp interactions and not interactions between chimps and humans, you might find evidence of sensitivity to ostension in non-human primates, but that they are in some sense defensive about this interacting with humans. Right. So that's an interesting suggestion. I haven't thought about it, about the fact that it's species difference that may interfere with discovering sensitivity to ostensive signals among chimps. So I don't know. That's a good open question for me. So far as the problem is that I think, so if pointing is taken to be a basic cooperative ostensive communicative action, which in humans, provides relevant information for the recipient and is always accompanied by these ostensive signals, which is, look into the recipient's eyes and alternate gaze between the pointed target and the recipient to make sure that the recipient is following the pointing and so on and so forth. The fact that chimps have not been observed to point very much at all themselves. I mean, but maybe, maybe we don't know enough. But so far as I know, Tomasello, for example, as I quoted, not only finds that they are not following and understanding human pointing when the human pointing is made in the chimp's benefit, to indicate where the location of food is when it could be in two possible locations. They just simply don't use this information, but also it seems as if chimps do not point very much for the benefit of other chimps. But okay, and then there's the problem of for example, gaze. Looking into another's gaze is really fundamental to engaging a human cooperative communication, as I'm doing now. Looking at you, and so now if I switch eye direction, you'll be very sensitive to that. It seems like non-human primates do not very much look into conspecifics eyes, but that's an interesting question. Okay, so your suggestion is look for sensitivity to ostensive signals in chimps when the signal is produced by a chimp and not by a human. No, I'm not able to provide an interesting answer to your suggestion, but I think it's worth exploring.
It's work up the relationship with the chimp before
Right.
attempting the extensive
Right.
communication.
Right. So it's true that sorry. No. This is an interesting question for further research. I'm not sure exactly how to pursue it, but I'm not a chimp scientist. So, thank you.
To follow up on this idea that Rodri raised. So I do work with non-human primates, and one thing about non-human primates in general, you can have them train them in a task that they obviously know how to do. Hold a grape in front of them, they'll reach and grasp it from you immediately.
Yes.
But if you change the context, whereby they're reaching now with some device that might measure their location of their hand in space, and you ask them to do a very similar task, it may take them months, if not years, or a year, let's say, to train up to properly do that task.
Uh-huh.
So from the outside, it looks like, for us as humans, very little has changed from A to B. Yet in the secondary task, it looks like they don't even know how to do this very simple behavior.
Right.
So I wonder the degree to which some of these experiments, where we compare what babies do or what young humans do, and what these animals are doing, how much of that is really a training effect? It's not so much that the animal can't innately do these things. It's just outside of the range of experience that typically would have in its environment.
I see.
I
Right.
don't know if you have any comments on along those lines.
Well,
whether it's special, whether it's really something that's innately different between humans and animals, or whether it's something that is experiential based on our environment and the things that we do, whereby we acquire this particular skill.
Yes. So that's another interesting question. So my comment to this issue that you're that you're raising is that for several years, a very smart chimp psychologist, Povinelli, tried to investigate how much chimps understand that seeing leads to knowing. Before the competitive paradigm that I discussed by Tomasello, Hare, and so on, where you have a subordinate and a dominant, and there is one piece of food that's visible to both and one piece of food that's occluded by a barrier from the dominant, and which food will the subordinate select, and that yielded positive result. But before that, what Povinelli was trying to do was to study how much chimps understand, how much whether seeing leads to knowing, by having chimps beg from a human experimenter who had food, but either was not looking at them, had their head, eyes away from them, or had a bucket on her head, or had a blindfold on her eyes, and using this paradigm of both begging and using these artifact for preventing the human to see, the conclusion was that that chimps were at chance, and so there was a completely negative conclusion. And in fact, the insight of Tomasello was really exactly your line of argument, basically, that using begging is so out of how chimps evolved in their ecology. Chimps do not beg, nor are they used to seeing others wearing buckets on their head and so on. The Tomasello Hare paradigm is based on the idea that interactions among chimps are very competitive. So if you have a dominant and a subordinate, you can elicit understanding that seeing leads to knowing by this paradigm, and but it's very much along the lines that you suggest. So now I cannot really answer in detail your question, but I think that progress was made following your suggestion in the past 10 years about how much of. So the initial conclusion was they don't understand conditions from knowing based on vision, but by changing from begging to competing, the evidence was radically changed, and that's really consistent with your suggestion.
Thank you for your talk. It's very, very interesting stuff. I have two small points that probably won't take very long.
Well, take your time.
Thank you. The first is that your table seems unnecessarily wrong.
Sure.
And in which case, I mean, the agent wouldn't necessarily gain anything, and the
Yes.
recipient might not lose, but
Well,
might be.
right. So let me reply to the first point before I forget it.
Sure.
So you're right that it's you should as you say, one should distinguish between a lie, which is deception, intentional deception, versus providing false information because one is not competent or one fails to know the fact. However, that will, in a sense, if the recipient trusts an untruthful agent, whether the agent is lying or incompetent, in fact, the agent gains from being trusted because the goal of the communicative action is to actually cause another to change, to acquire a new belief. Whether, right? So even though you are completely right that we should distinguish two kinds of untruthfulness on an agent's part, right? As you said, one which is deliberate deception and the other which is incompetence. In fact, what the goal of the communicative agent is to be trusted, whether he is, deceiving or incompetent. His goal is to be trusted by the recipient. Okay, so he gains from being trusted in this cell, right? So even if he's not lying, he still gains, but the recipient loses from trusting the agent. Do you see the point?
Gaining in the sense of succeeding at changing a belief,
Yes,
or
sure.
gaining in the sense
No.
of knowing where the food is?
No. The goal of the communicative action is to change the recipient's mind by making the recipient acquire either a new belief or a new desire. For example, if I say, please open the window, okay, or would you please open the window? Be kind enough to open the window. I'm trying to cause you to acquire a desire to act. Now, suppose you do not share either my appreciation for the temperature of the room, and you disagree. You would actually not like the window to be open, or you do not respect. You don't respect my authority, and so you will not acquire on faith a desire to act in accordance with my request. So you understand perfectly well what my communicative intention is, but you may fail to fulfill what I call my informative intention, which is to acquire a new desire. Okay, so my goal in that case was to change your mind. In the case of where my informative intention is to cause you to acquire a new belief. Okay, the same. My goal is that you trust me. Now, either I can deliberately deceive you, or I can be incompetent. That's an important distinction. That's very important. That's a very important distinction. But in both cases, whether I lie or whether I'm incompetent, I share the goal of trying to cause you to acquire a new belief. And so I gain if you trust me, whether I lie or whether I'm incompetent. And you lose if you're my recipient, if you actually do change your mind and acquire a new belief in accordance with either my lie or my incompetence.
You didn't believe any of that, right?
I'm on the fence. My second point, I'm not sure if you'll actually have anything to say about this, but I'm quite interested in the idea that you're calling pointing a cooperative,
Ostensive.
ostensive gesture. But it's interesting that, while we may understand it as a cooperative gesture in the sense of objects, cross-culturally, people tend not to think that pointing is acceptable when directed at individuals.
Sure.
And
At individual, at conspecifics. I mean, other humans.
Yes,
But inanimate objects, yes, or animals.
Sure.
Yeah. Right.
So it's interesting that
Sure.
that there
That's
might
interesting.
be more content
Sure. No.
in the act of pointing
Sure.
than simply directing the gaze.
Well, that's very interesting. So you mean that there may be cultural variation in tolerating targets of pointing. So different cultures, different social groups, we have different attitudes towards using pointing when the target is a human, is another human.
It seems to be quite widespread that pointing with your index finger at another individual, either a friend or a quite rude.
Mm.
It's quite surprisingly
Okay.
widespread.
Okay. No, that's interesting.
So I just thought it was
So no, I don't have anything to say, but I think it would be worth investigating this cultural variation, these cultural variations with respect to the kind of the range of targets which are acceptable as targets of an act of pointing or ones that are not. I mean, and I don't know anything about this, but you're right. I'm sure that you must be right, and you must be. No, I think the idea of cultural variation in this realm makes a lot of sense, but I have nothing really to say relevant more than to recognize that it's an interesting issue for cross-cultural investigation, I think.
Very rude. Robert next. Right.
So maybe just a suggestion of something might be interesting, and then a request for a little bit of elaboration. The first is that Laurie Sanders's work might be interesting in terms of
Sure.
So this is rhesus monkeys in their natural environment.
Sure.
And so far as I'm aware, she has some different results from Thomas Alva. Maybe some of the things about gaze rather than head position can be different
Uh-huh.
in case of the natural environment. But I'm trying to remember stuff
Right.
I've seen stuff I read a few years ago.
Right. So as I remember it, but I don't remember it in enough details now, but I think that she and collaborators ran an experiment not on chimps but on rhesus monkeys, as you say, using a slightly different paradigm so it was cheating from a human. And the evidence was, the outcome was exactly similar to the Tomasello-Hare paradigm for chimps, that cheating, which is competitive, where the partner is a human as opposed to being either a subordinate or dominant member of the same species. The result was the same, that is that they understood that seeing leads to knowing, so if the human sees cheating, so they cheat only when the human cannot see, cannot know. Right, exactly. But the outcome is the same limitations, no evidence for tracking false belief in rhesus monkeys, as far as I know, from this group from Lentosaurus.
No, it was more to do
Laurie
with
Sanderson.
seeing if they were blindfolded and stuff like that.
That's right, exactly.
The other thing I want to ask is, so I think it's really interesting that what sort of level of frame about theory of mind being evolutionary, having an evolutionary component. And I guess a lot of us are thinking about the joint attention literature, and the way the joint attention literature treats the sort of developmental stage that people go through. So initially children fixate on the eyes, and steadily they learn to track the direction of eye movements. Then after that they learn to direct eye movements towards something, and then pointing seems to be sort of built on that. So I'm wondering, when you talk about the importance of eye gaze and there being maybe a genetic component
Yes.
to theory of mind application, are you saying that it's coming in built as a box, or are you saying that there are more basic components that it's being built up of?
Good question. That's too hard. I mean, that's too hard for me now, and yeah. But it's you're right. That's a very big, large, and important question. So, you know, I'd rather go back to the little bit I know of the empirical findings rather than to address this big, large architectural question, which is absolutely legitimate, very important, and which I will fail to answer properly now. But so there is very interesting evidence by the Hungarian group that by the age of 8 months, if an infant of 8 months, okay, first is being gazed at, and then the adult switches her gaze elsewhere, the 8-month-old have a referential expectation that there must be some object where the agent gazed at after gazing at her, the infant, and so when there is nothing, they look much longer than when there is something. Okay, so it seems as if first gazing at an infant and then switching gaze triggers automatically in 8-month-olds who can't speak really much at all, a referential expectation for interpreting this eye-looking behavior on the part of the agent. So, but that's 8 months old. So with respect to my, big, large claims about mind reading abilities, in particular the ability to track the contents of others' false beliefs, and whether we'll know more about the understanding of intentionality with an S in very young kids. This is something that's now being. So I can tell you one but I agree with you that so far my large claims seem insufficiently structured, so to speak. But what I just wanted to convey was, okay, so I've been really impressed by reading the developmental literature and reading at how more and more evidence seems to suggest that, contrary to what was thought in 1990 or 2000, 2004, 2003, the fact that 3-year-olds fail the famous Aunt Sally false belief task should not be interpreted as evidence that they fail to track the contents of others' false belief, but they fail for independent reasons. Okay? Now, when you think of it, it seems clear that having the ability to track another's false belief cannot be sufficient to pass these elicited false belief tasks, because, for example, you have to understand the sentence that is the question being asked, like, where will Sally look? So, a mature mind reader who speaks only Russian will fail the task if the question is asked in English. You also have to understand that the pragmatics of the question, which is where will Sally, not where should Sally, okay, and that's complicated. You have to have executive resources which help you inhibit your knowledge of where the toy is from intruding into your answer. You have to inhibit your potential, propensity to help. A lot of things might explain why you fail this task, even if you have the ability to track the contents of others' false belief. And now the point of my talk was, given this evidence, it seems to me that if you claim that infants can track the contents of others' false belief, it's just half of the story if you think of the evolved capacity to cause others to have false belief, because you are a communicative agent, and also because you are the recipient of others' communicative action, where you have to make yourself invulnerable or not entirely vulnerable to deception. So I'm trying to say, look, many people resist the idea that infants can track the contents of others' false belief. That seems like an impossible feat, But if you think of this ability in light of the ability to engage in ostensive communication, whereby you can either deceive someone, you can cause someone to change her mind, or you have to actually understand, change your mind or not change your mind according to what the communicative agent is trying to achieve, then it becomes less, it seems to me, of an implausible assertion that very early infants must be born with an ability to track the contents of others' false belief, because in fact the whole story is that they can cause others. And it doesn't seem to be something very widely shared among other species, that they have this ability to point to a place where the toy isn't, to make the other believe that the toy is there, when in fact the agent who points knows that it's not there. Sure.
So I was just talking about this today, and I started thinking that it'd be really interesting to see that at what point does a child that's learned this following a gaze, or the ability to direct attention, pointing, does it learn to do the opposite, to decouple the kind of informational state and trick something? So the child wants to achieve something and points to the other place.
Right. Okay. So I don't know of controlled experiments, but we all know from kids, and we remember that when we break something and we don't want to be punished, we deny that we did it, and that's in fact deception. So if a caretaker or a mother say, did you break this? And you did, but you say no. So that's a little bit like pointing to the empty location in order to to deceive someone into believing that the toy is where you point when you know that it's not. Right? So in fact, you dispoint to yourself when you know that you did it, for example.
Right.
To set up my question, I had wanted to suggest that when we gather information from the perceptual system,
right,
that I may see a target, or I may see pointing to indicate a target, or I see where your gaze is directed, that these perceptual cues give us information about tasks we may have, and we can call these beliefs.
Right.
But then we can, again, as you
Yeah.
displayed beautifully, have beliefs about beliefs,
Yes.
and therefore beliefs about beliefs about beliefs.
Right.
So in setting up a kind of a type theory for beliefs, I was
Yes.
going to ask a developmental question,
Right.
which has really just been posed to you, and you've given most of the answer. And that is, what is the developmental story that you can say
Yeah.
about an agent's ability to have types of beliefs?
Right. Yes.
And then, but then since you've answered.
No.
What would be the limits to the
Okay,
technical
so-
types of
right,
beliefs?
so-
It's a type theory.
So I think I'm not going to answer your the question about, how is there a limit to the kind of type.
It's a side question.
No, but that's an important question. So I don't know what the limit is, and I don't know whether there's a developmental there certainly is. But I think you point to a fundamental question, which is that to track another's belief, okay, the simple operation of having a belief about another's belief. Actually, simple mind reading is to form beliefs about another's mental states, whether beliefs, desires, intentions, emotion, whatever. If I ascribe an emotion or an intention or a belief to you, I believe that you believe or you intend or you are in such an effective state and so on. Now, in a way, it seems to me that to do this, what you have to do is use your own beliefs with contents that you may entertain, okay, in order to track the content of the other's belief, whether true or false. So when you are ascribing a belief, you're forming a belief about another's belief, let's say, and let's forget about the fact that you can also form beliefs about others' intentions, and you are making use of beliefs with contents that you may entertain yourself. Okay, so if I say, for example, you believe that Sarkozy is a great politician, okay, and I don't believe it, for example, but I actually use, in order to characterize the content of your belief, a belief with a content that I might entertain, okay? And that's the basic task of actually mind reading another's belief. That is, I'm actually making use, recycling, if you like, beliefs that I may entertain, that I may also not entertain, but I may entertain them, and I use the contents of these beliefs that I might entertain in order to describe, to depict, to capture the content of your own beliefs, right? And this kind of, so if that is what's happening, and I'm again bracketing the question of how many types, whether you could form beliefs, and so on. But this first kind of operation, if you are not born with this ability as an infant, how could you learn to recycle the contents of your putative own belief in order to capture the belief of your conspecifics? So that is not an answer to the question of the limits of types, really, which is something actually to be studied also experimentally. I mean, I think there are how far the recursion can go, if you like, in actual psychological situations. Is it like grammar, which where you could, there's no grammatical, let's say Chomsky made the point that there is no limit on the size of a sentence, and therefore on the size of the set of sentences of a natural language. Okay, so it's potentially non-finite. So whether this kind of how far does the recursivity go? Is it logically possible to have an infinite embedding? I mean, X believes that, Y believes that, and so on. But what's the psychological limitations in terms of time and energy and processing and so on? But I'm making another point, which is that the first operation, which is to actually embed one of your putative beliefs in order to depict another's belief as part of your belief. When you say he believes that so and so, you're expressing your belief that he believes that so and so. But in order to capture the content of the other's belief, you have to use the content of your own belief recycled for this task. Now the question is, if you're not built by evolution to do this, what is the kind of learning, teaching? I mean, teaching is out, right? I mean, teaching is, you don't go to school to ascribe beliefs, right? I mean, you agree that you don't learn to ascribe beliefs by going to school. parents do not do not teach their kids how to ascribe beliefs. So the question is, how could you learn to do this if you are not built with the ability to do it? And it's a big challenge, I think. So I'm not answering your major question about the structure, but I think it's a big challenge. So recently, Chris Frith and Celia Hayes compared learning to read minds to learning to read words. But this is crazy in a way, right? I mean, you certainly cannot learn to read others' minds the way you learn to read words, because in order to learn to read words, you need mind reading. You need to, you need a kind of cultural learning that rests on understanding a model's intention and beliefs.
Thanks.
Bill?
A small follow-up. There's Robert Almond is an economist with a lot of pretty Nobel Prize.
Kahneman. You said Kahneman, Dan Kahneman.
Almond.
Oh, Almond. Sorry, excuse me. Sure.
You didn't get the
Sorry.
first one.
Right. Almond. Yes.
And a philosopher named David Lewis, who was talking about convention. And in both of these things, what it turned out, there's this, the common knowledge assumption in setting up the Apes for rational agents is not just that everybody knows it, but that A knows, that B knows, that C knows, and you can iterate it up as
Yes.
far as you want.
Yes.
And that's the same thing that Lewis made as his basis for conventions.
Right.
And if you think about driving, you want to know that the other side knows that you're driving too,
Right,
not just
right.
the people. And there's a lot of, there's a certain amount of literature on how iterated this stuff. But it's sort of one of the things that Lewis is doing in his convention book, and that Alvin also does in James, is that you want to have, you assume that it's indefinite. Because if you actually put in that it breaks,
Yes.
then it just breaks.
Okay. So that's an answer to the question about the type, the limits.
It didn't answer about how far it's possible.
Right.
But there is this assumption,
Yes.
and we all act as though we could just
Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. That's interesting. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So this sort of draws on the earlier questions people were asking you about the apes. And so you mentioned specifically that chimpanzees have certain deficits, but we generalize that to great apes. Are there other animal models that were drawn upon? Chimpanzees have a fairly particular social structure that they're typically found in, as exemplified by the sub-dom relationship that we could exploit to find out whether or not inclusion works. But that's not the only social structure that apes will embed themselves in between type of ape, and also the amount of resources available, depending on where they are, they'll engage in very different types of behaviors. So, I mean, we also sort of know that eye contact among chimpanzees or gorillas is aggressive.
Right.
But that's not universal to all of us.
To all non-human primates.
Yeah. So, do we have a way of generalizing? Is there other evidence, or have we looked at whether or not apes that sort of embed themselves in different social structures, perhaps ones that are substantially more cooperative than the ones that chimpanzees typically structure themselves around? If we looked at those would be the ones where if there's greater impetus to cooperate, there would be greater impetus to develop the type of ostensive communications that we're looking for. And could it just be that we're looking at the wrong model?
Could be. So I'm not able to answer your question. I don't know enough. I don't know the literature. There's a very interesting. So I think that, for example, in Leipzig, where Tomasello's group studies chimps, there are bonobos and probably maybe some gorillas. So bonobos, I think, from what I understand, which is very little, from what I know, which is very little, are not significantly different. Although behaviorally they're not exactly identical to chimps, but I don't think the evidence is that that what's true for bonobos is not true for chimps or vice versa. But there's a very interesting book, which I highly recommend to people, which is a book by the biological anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Rdy. So Rdy is written H-R-D-Y, and the book is called Mothers and Others. So, and the title of the book is Mothers and Others. And her point, is that alloparentality, that is the sharing of taking care of children, which is so important to humans, is really unknown in non-human primates, so even in bonobos. So she claims that the fact that human mothers can be helped to raise kids by their own mothers, and even by males, is something that doesn't work in other non-human primates, although there is, social insects are different from the apes, and some lower monkeys, like marmosets, also do go some way towards shared care of children. But non-human primates, who are really closer from both evolutionary and genetic standpoint to humans, do not do that. And so I don't think that, and I think that she covers bonobos as well as, so I think you were thinking mostly of bonobos. Yeah. But I don't know the details enough to really offer some solid answer to you. But I think that book is really, Mothers and Others is really a wonderful book. 2009, I think.
I have another general question. What neural mechanisms might be responsible for our unique ability to understand others?
Okay, so, yeah. Okay, so, so there are two, I mean, I'm not, not so much is known, I think, about the brain basis of these psychological research, but some is known. One of the great person who's done work on mind reading and the brain support, the brain basis for mind reading, is Rebecca Sachs, S-A-X-E, at MIT. So the region that's repeatedly mentioned in relation to mind reading, so I'm talking about really mind reading, the ability to track the contents of others' psychological states, including false beliefs, is the right, it's called the right TPJ, temporal parietal junction. It's a small area of the brain, but Jody, would be much, that seems to be, systematically involved in tasks where a participant is really trying to make sense of another psychological states. But of course, as much developmental research suggests, executive resources might be also very important. Ability for inhibition, that will involve other areas of the brain, frontal areas, and so on. So I'm sorry to be very disappointing, because that's just that I don't know much, and that this is actually, I think, in neuroscience, a controversial issue so far, because so again, the right TPJ is repeatedly discussed and mentioned by brain imaging studies of humans involved in tasks of mind reading, but not much more I can say. But I can refer you to there are review papers by Rebecca Sachs, who is, I think, one of the leading researcher who has done really relevant work on adults, on young children. It seems to me that she recently came to change her mind on the infants' work. Also there's a question. So one question, I guess, if you want to map the infants' work with what's known of the brain, is of course that a lot of brain maturation, if you took 6 months old, when the kind of experiment that I showed with decrease of alpha signal as indicative of rising motor activity in the motor cortex of a 6 months old who sees an agent with a false belief that there is a ball in the box when the infant knows that the box is empty, and so on. So that's, I found this, really interesting. I don't know about the state of the maturation of the motor system that supports the fact that, decrease of alpha signal in 6 months old can be interpreted as rising motor activity when the child is actually confronted with an agent with a false belief that the ball is in the box, when the child knows that the ball is not in the box. But so I don't know how what's known about the maturity both of the motor cortex in 6 months old and the RTPJ, if the RTPJ is a necessary part of the brain for tracking the psychological. I just don't know.
Okay, well with that, we're at time, so we'll thank Pierre and in this very handsome tote bag with the money in it, and join me in thanking Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.